also excited to continue in this series, In the Lead. This is something that God put on my heart. For all of us, no matter if you're a person who's a stay-at-home parent, you're a CEO, you're an hourly employee, you have influence wherever you're at. If you're a student here today, you're getting ready to go back to school, you have influence where you are going. You're not even sure where you're going to be, but you have goals and you have influence today, and your influence is going to grow as your goals grow and as you grow. And so we wanted to talk about what do we do with that influence. And Nehemiah is the book that we've been studying. I hope you've been reading that. And our next speaker in this series, I'm very excited about. He came to us about 9 years ago, he and his wife, and they just began to serve all over this church. And he was an executive in General Motors Acceptance Corp., and he came, and God called them to Richmond, Virginia. And they walked into West End Assembly of God, and they knew immediately that this was the place that God wanted them to use their gifts, and they began to serve. And 7 years ago, he came on staff. 5 years ago, we made him a pastor, and this is his first Sunday morning preaching, so y'all be good. And welcome, Pastor Rodney Green.
Good morning. Great to see you. I usually see you from out in the hallway and greet you there, because I know most of you, and I'm just real excited to have this opportunity this morning to come and to share a little bit with what God has put on my heart that has to do with leadership. So you don't always come to church, to a worship service, to hear about leadership. But Pastor Shane shared with us last week when he spoke. He shared with us that every one of us, we're really a leader. Every one of you is a leader. Some of you are going, no, that's not true. I'm a servant. I serve. That you are leading someone. You have influence. And because of that, so much about what's in the book of Nehemiah is really, really important. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So let me give a couple of just thoughts before I get started. The first one is, for any of you visitors that might be with us, or if you're watching online, when the choir left a few minutes ago, it wasn't because they thought I was going to speak. That's pretty normal for us to have that happen, and they're out here somewhere excitedly waiting for the message today. The other thing is that the name of the sermon today is Building the Wall. Now, if you know about Nehemiah, you know that this is a wall around Jerusalem. But when I was talking to Jim Washok, who is our communications director, and he was putting out on all of our different social media and everything, he was putting out there promos about today's sermon. And he said, what's the title of your sermon? And I said, it's Building the Wall. And it just got completely quiet. And he said, really? Are you sure you want to go there? And you know, I was so entrenched in what I was going to talk about that I hadn't even thought about the wall and who was going to pay for it. So this morning, I promise you, we're not talking about that wall. Even though I would love to share some leadership principles with a lot of people that have to do with the wall. So no more about politics. No more about politics. As Shane said, today we're continuing our series. This is our third Sunday, third week in our series, In the Lead, focusing on the book of Nehemiah. The first week, Chuck Bassamo, you guys were that, I hope we're here to hear him. Chuck came and spoke, and he talked about accepting the challenge. Nehemiah accepting the challenge from God to go 800 miles and build this wall around Jerusalem. And he talked about our challenges and what God may be asking us to accept and what for us to do and how we could do that. You know, the wonderful thing about Chuck is his beard. If you saw him, he comes in and he has this presence because of his appearance that are like set you up. You're going, I don't know, is this John the Baptist coming? What is this? He has a great appearance. And there's only one or two people in our church that even can compare with that beard. Tony, sitting right back here. Hey, Tony. But Pastor Chuck very passionately shared with us about accepting the challenge that each of us has and hearing that challenge from God. And then last week, Pastor Shane taught us how Nehemiah waited on God with prayer and preparation. That all of us are waiting on God about something. Some of us are more urgent about that. Some of us have needs or concerns, but we're all waiting on God. So what do we do while we're waiting on God? Well, Pastor Shane shared how that we do that with prayer and preparation. You know, after that service, I can't tell you how many people I actually talked to in the hallway that shared their stories about how much that service meant to them because they're waiting on God, and this helps them to do that. Today we're going to talk about Nehemiah, and Nehemiah actually arriving in Jerusalem and starting to build the wall and facing one of the greatest challenges, one of the periods of his life filled with the greatest challenges that he had ever faced. We're going to join him and we're going to build the wall together, and I'm going to take us all back there, out of here in this worship center. I'm going to take us back so that we're part of that group that are actually participating. I want us to think about it and feel it, because I don't think you can understand it unless you do. I don't think there's any way to understand that. One other little thing, when you arrived today, I hope you received a Lego. So if you didn't, we have more at the door a little bit later. But if you did, I would like for you just to hold on to that. Please don't discard it. Don't throw it at me during the service. Hold on to your Lego or building block, because we're going to use those later together. Building the wall took an amazing amount of coordination and leadership. An amazing amount. It took great teamwork. It took great planning. And not only did it take all those things, but just when those things got going, there was great conflict. Conflict from the outside, external conflict, and eventually internal conflict. So Nehemiah, it points to Nehemiah and what a great leader he was. And there's been many great leaders throughout history. Many great leaders throughout history. And you probably know of some of them. You probably know some great leaders. In fact, you may be a great leader. But to get us thinking about leadership, I want to share some of my favorite leadership quotes. And as I share these quotes, I would love for you to think of the characteristics that are being pointed out in each quote. And then as we talk about Nehemiah, compare and contrast those things. The first quote is by Arnold Glasgow. A leader takes a little more than his share of the blame and a little less than his share of the credit. A leader takes a little less of his share of the blame, a little more of his share of the blame, and a little less than his share of his credit. A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership is the capacity to translate vision into reality. Warren Bennis. The price of greatness is responsibility. Winston Churchill. You can't lead without responsibility. And lastly, leadership is a potent combination of strategy and character. But if you must be without one, be without the strategy. You can't lead without character. You can't lead without character. Those are some great, if you notice the names on all of these quotes, that last one was Norman Schwarzkopf. If you notice the names, these are some really people that are talked about, infamous, famous for their leadership and different things. Nehemiah, what they did, any of these people, was no greater than what Nehemiah did. Nehemiah took an underdog team. He took an underdog team and he coordinated, planned, motivated, coached, all of them, so that they would start building this huge wall that I'm going to describe to you in just a minute. But you probably know of some other great coaches. You probably know of some other examples of teamwork. And so I have a couple I'd like to share with you. The two that I've chosen to share with you, they're from the 1980s, and I picked them because I think everyone knows about them. Now, I know some of you weren't even born in 1980, but I'm pretty confident that because of these events that you actually know about them. The first one is referred to as the Miracle on Ice. The Miracle on Ice is 1980, the United States men's ice hockey team. They were played really well throughout the Olympics, and as they went along, they kept winning and winning, and they finally got to the championship game. And in the championship game, they were playing against the team that was expected to be there, the Soviet Union. It was a true David and Goliath scenario where the United States team was made up of amateurs and college players, and the Soviet Union team was made up of some of the greatest talent there was in the world. And anybody that was even pulling for the U.S., they didn't expect them to win. They just hoped they'd score one goal. They were just hoping we would score against them. But thanks to the leadership of their coach, Herb Brooks, they pulled off an amazing upset. They beat the Soviet Union 4-3 that day. And if you go back, there's been books written on it, there's been movies written on it. If you go back and you look at any of that, there's this great locker room speech and great coaching that took place by Herb Brooks. And there was some great leadership on the ice as they were playing. The other great example I just want to share with you real quickly comes from the 1983 NCAA basketball championship. And I am sure if you've watched any sports at any time, you've seen a replay of Jim Valvano running down the court, jumping up and down just after his North Carolina team, North Carolina State, not to be confusing there, red and blue, North Carolina State had beaten the University of Houston. Now let me tell you, that year, the University of Houston completely dominated basketball. Completely dominated every team. North Carolina State wasn't even supposed to get close to getting into the final game. But they did. And Coach Valvano was such an inspiration and had such a good game plan. They kept the game close to the very end and ended up winning with a very last second shot. And as I said, it's one of the iconic replays that you're going to see when you watch sports. It would be like today, it would be going viral if it was happening in today's world. So I'm sure that you also have your own stories about sports teams, about underdogs winning. I'm sure you all have those, but let me just assure you that none of them are greater than what Nehemiah did. So let me set the stage for you. So this actually happened 2,400 years ago. 2,400 years ago. Pretty sure none of us were alive then. And it was about 160 years after Jerusalem had been destroyed. So Babylon came in, one of many different nations that came in and destroyed Jerusalem and just ransacked it, the city. Knocked it down, burnt the gates. Now, when I say knock down the walls, Pastor Shane last week shared with us what these walls look like. The walls that around Jerusalem, 2.5 miles around. 2.5 miles. Now, do you know how far 2.5 miles is? 2.5 miles? I'm a runner. I can tell you, I measure it completely. So if you were at City Stadium, where the Richmond Kickers play, and you run from it toward Carey Street, you go from Carey Street to Arthur Ashe Boulevard, and then you turn north on Arthur Ashe Boulevard, and you run to the stadium where the Flying Squirrels play. That's just about 2.5 miles. That's a lot of land. That's a lot of walls. And these walls are 8 feet wide and 12 feet tall. And they were knocked down. The gates were burnt. Nehemiah came in and he said, this is what we're going to do. So you can see what an unbelievable challenge there was in front of Nehemiah. So how did he respond to that? Nehemiah gathered all of the people of the city together and of the surrounding towns that were Israelites. And there were many others there that weren't Israelites. There were many enemies of Israel that were still there, that lived in the land. But he gathered them all together and he challenged them to come together to rebuild the city's walls. He motivated them with a vision of security. If we can get the walls back, we'll be safe. And a reminder of how bad things were. If you look with me in Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burnt. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. The other countries were making fun of them. They were making fun of all that they had said about their great God. And they were just insulted, very ugly things that were said. And Nehemiah goes on to say, I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me, had been upon Nehemiah for good, and how it had helped him get to where he was. He had traveled 800 miles. He had arranged for all the materials that they needed to rebuild the wall. And he said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. Nehemiah did a great job of inspiring his people and coordinating the rebuilding project. At first, everything was going really well. So now, here's how this worked. Here's how it worked. So the wall goes all the way around the city, Everybody's enclosed if it were built. But what's happening is the walls are broken up. They've knocked the walls down. The gates have been burnt. But there's people that are still living there in the city. And they live around the wall. They round near it. And so what he did, he encouraged everybody to start working on the part of the wall right in front of where they lived. So he divided this huge 2.5 mile perimeter into little sections that everybody could work on. And as he did that, God blessed them and they continued to do really well. And they were making great progress on everything they were doing. But things began to change. Doesn't that happen? We have these tasks that we're trying to do and we all start out really well. And then there's all these obstacles, these speed bumps that come up and start to interfere with what we're doing. That's what Nehemiah began to face. And he faced them both from an external source and an internal source. So I want to talk first about this external source. And just remind you that nothing reveals what a leader is made of any better than how he or she deals with crisis. Sometimes we have this idea that if we're doing something, we think we're on the correct path, we're accomplishing something we think for God. We have this idea that if something goes wrong, we must be wrong. If something goes wrong, we need to change what we're doing. If something goes wrong, we need to stop what we're doing. That's not biblical. God never promised us smooth roads. He doesn't promise us that we're not going to have hiccups in our life. God, in fact, does tell us that we are going to have those things. And that the more that you're doing to work with God, the more you may see that. God's plan for your life will intersect with pain. Jesus said it plainly. Do not think I have come to bring peace, but a sword. And if you follow me, sometimes your enemies will be the people of your own household. That was foretelling for what Nehemiah was about to face. So we're going to talk about his outside conflicts, his enemies. In Nehemiah chapter 4, now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. You know, let me put a little asterisk right here. So there's a number of names that we're going to run across that Sanballat, Tobiah, a lot of names like that. So if you haven't noticed, I have a southern accent. And so when I'm taking seminary classes and we're in the Hebrew, they didn't do Southern Hebrew. It's a really challenge. In fact, in one of my classes, we're doing Hebrew, and then the professor decides that she wants us to sing, and so we're going to be singing the song in Hebrew. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard me sing, but when my kids were growing up, we were sitting in church one day, and they were sitting beside me, and I don't remember exactly how old they were, middle school or something. And, I didn't realize how bad my singing was. And I was singing along in church, and I looked around, and I noticed they weren't there anymore. So when your own sons move away from you, it tells you. So singing in Hebrew wasn't my thing. And so today, just bear with the southern accent on some of the Hebrew names. Some of these aren't even Hebrew, but there's the asterisk for that. So Sanballat, he was jeering at them, jeering at the Jews because he was upset. He's a Samaritan. You know about Samaritans and Israelis? They don't get along. They've been fighting forever. They really don't like each other. But let me just say this about this particular guy. One of the signs of an infection of the heart is when you are angry when others are successful. And when you're happy when others fail. So it's an infection for you to watch for in that. And certainly Sanballat was guilty of that. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? Tobiah was beside him, and he said, yes, what are they building? If a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Again, all this ridicule, derision, sarcasm, psychological things that they're doing against Nehemiah. So how did Nehemiah respond? He first responded by praying. In Nehemiah 4 it says, hear me, O God, for we are despised. He turned to God first. Any leader who first faces a challenge, I encourage you to turn to God first with prayer. In times of crisis particularly. But Nehemiah was confident. Nehemiah said, this was God's idea. I'm going to assume God has a strategy for getting us through this crisis. So how does that apply to you right now? Let me ask you an honest question. Before you made your last decision, did you pray about it? Or just rely on your own resources to make that decision? When you faced your most recent conflict, did you pray about it? Is that your first thought? Have you ever made a bad decision? Nehemiah, a good leader, he first turned to God. And a leader who can pray is only limited by God's resources. And God's resources are infinite. God's resources are infinite. Well, when Sanballat and Tobiah saw that their psychological threats didn't stop the building, they changed up. They changed what they were doing, and they started making physical threats. So again, the building's going on. You're in the midst of all this. You've got people jeering at you, making jokes about your work, and now you're beginning to hear physical threats. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were getting to be closed, they were very angry. So they were very angry at their success, and they plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and give confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. So again, Nehemiah does several things, and I'm just going to list a few of those things for you real quickly. Nehemiah first prays, and then after he prays, he does his best to make the best decisions given the wisdom that God has given him. He secures a team. So the team's scared now. They're going to come and attack. How can they build the wall? They have no protection. How can they do that? So if you read Nehemiah, you'll learn that he set up guards around the walls. He recruited other servants as soldiers. He provided weapons for them. And he developed a plan of communication where here, if they come, we're going to sound the trumpet and you'll know that there's an attack coming. The purpose of all these things was to make his team, his people, feel comfortable and secure. So as a leader, and remember you're a leader, as a leader, how do you make your team feel safe? How do you make your spouse feel safe? How do you make your kids and your family and those around you? Because we all face things that shake us and scare us, whether that's disease, whether that's unhealthy marriages, whether that's job issues. We all face those things. What are we doing? What are you doing to make your family feel secure and safe? The other thing that Nehemiah did, he was highly visible. And I looked, this is Nehemiah, and I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers. Fight for your sons. Fight for your daughters. Fight for your wives. And fight for your homes. It's incredibly important that we as leaders were highly visible, particularly in the midst of a crisis. Never underestimate the power of your presence, of standing before people or your family and letting them see that you are not afraid. Let me give you two illustrations of leaders who were highly visible in times of crisis. Everyone remembers 9/11. Everyone has seen video of 9/11. Now, if you look back and you look at the rubble and you look at all the things that are going on, one thing that you can notice is that the captains and the lieutenants were all out there rushing with their fellow firefighters. They were out there in their presence, making themselves visible for that crisis. Another more recent crisis was when Hurricane Harvey devastated the Gulf of Mexico. It hit Texas, it hit Houston, it hit all that area. Well, J.J. Watts is a football player, professional football player. You may have heard of him. And J.J. Watts, who plays for the Houston Texans, he made himself highly visible. He stood up. He said, hey, I want to raise $1 million to help with all these people that are hurting. And the way he did that was not to just to be vocal, but he put $100,000 of his own money to start it out. He was very visible, and people got behind him and followed him. The last thing Nehemiah did when he faced this external conflict was he set a standard of commitment. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at the time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon in his right hand. It's always true that the leader should set the standard of commitment, but it's vitally important in a crisis. So that high visibility, standard of commitment, those are really important things that for us to do as leaders. Now I can tell you that any leader I know would prefer to have an external crisis or external conflict rather than an internal one. External threats can give you a greater sense of identity and community. It bonds you together, but an internal conflict can be devastating. Just think about that. Think about all the things. There's been many opponents that many a team and organization has faced where that the external competition or opponent, they rallied behind themselves. Everyone got together and actually made them stronger. But the impact of an internal conflict has brought many a team, an organization, a family down. So for Nehemiah, the walls being built, everything's going along. They're facing these external conflicts, these enemies coming in trying to help them. But he keeps going. He's overcoming all those. And then all of a sudden, the rich people within the city, the people with more of the money, and these are all the Israelites, they start hoarding the food from the people that didn't have food, that didn't have money. So just imagine what's happening here. So everybody's working on the wall. Some people have some money and they have food. Some people are working on the wall and they don't have money and they don't have food and they can't go work their fields because they're busy building the wall. And then the people that have money said, well, you need some food? Let me sell it to you. And they charge exorbitant prices. And then the people needed loans. They needed loans to do different things just to survive. And they started charging high interest rates. Loan sharks. 2,400 years ago, loan sharks. They're charging these higher usury rates against the people. And so it's so bad that the Israelites, the poorer Israelites, they began to actually enslave their children, themselves. They sell their land. They do everything they can to satisfy. Well, as soon as Nehemiah began to hear about this, he took action against it. He recognized how bad that was. And he recognized that the damage that was being done to his team was so much greater than what these enemies were trying to do or had even accomplished. You know, far more families are divided over internal squabbles than external attacks. Far more organizations collapse from within, from internal strife than from competition. And far more churches split over arguments between members than any outside attack from a culture that's unbelieving. There's nothing that Satan loves more than to find a man or woman that he can keep constantly stirring up controversy. Nehemiah does what every Christian leader should do when there is an internal controversy. Three main things. Real quickly, we've already talked about praying. So the first thing he does is start praying about it. The second thing he does is he moves toward the problem. Sometimes you think a problem will go away. Have you ever had that? Have you ever had some of your kids and they were having arguments, they were at each other, and you just think, gee, they'll grow up, it'll go away. It doesn't go away. Have you ever had that with in your marriage, where that you're arguing about things and you're thinking that's going to go away? It doesn't go away. Far too often we tend to think that and we don't address it. Nehemiah did. He went directly to it. I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, "You are exacting interest, each from his brother." And I held a meeting against them. Nehemiah said, "You've got to stop this right now. It isn't right. What you're doing is wrong." And then ultimately he stands up and shakes his robes. Now I know that we don't shake our robes today. But Nehemiah says, "I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out every man from his house, from his labor, who does not keep his promise. So may he be shaken out and emptied." Without talking a lot about what it means to shake out your robe, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. Nehemiah took this internal conflict much, much more seriously than the external threats. So what is your internal conflict? I would say that we all have some internal conflicts. Maybe it's a rift between your husband or your wife. Maybe you have a conflict with your kids or with your parents. Perhaps there's some conflict at work and you just simply avoid it. Sometimes internal conflict can happen at church. You know, Matthew 5:23-24 says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, this is Jesus talking. If you're offering your gift at the altar, and there, while you're at the altar, you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there. Go to your brother. First be reconciled, and then come back and offer your gift. Trying to heal a relational rift is much more important than practically anything else that you can do. More important than sitting here. In another place, Jesus said, "Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Go do it fast." So are you dealing with conflict in your lives? How are you responding? We talked about how Nehemiah responds. How are you responding to conflict? Whether it's external or internal. Let me encourage you. We all have conflicts in our lives. Nehemiah has taught us how to move forward. It begins with prayer. And we want to pray with you this morning about your conflicts. Would you bow your heads? If you're living in conflict right now, if you have something that's eating away at you, would you just raise your hand? Every head bowed. Would you just raise your hand? It can be in your marriage. It can be with your kids or your parents. It can be with a neighbor or a coworker. It could be with your church. Would you you just raise your hand and let God lead you to resolution? Oh, Father, you see the hands that are raised here today. You see the hands that aren't raised, but they maybe should be. Oh God, there's no conflict too small, too large for you. Oh God, our Creator, our Almighty Father. Father, I pray for your hand to be on each conflict in each person's life. I pray, Father, that you would just put your arms around each situation. Father, I pray for peace. I pray so that these conflicts can be resolved, so that we can come together as a team, as a family, as a marriage, and we can move forward with your vision for us, because you have a great design for our lives. Thank you, O Lord. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Would you thank Pastor Rodney?
Got one more thing. Thank you, Pastor Shane. I have just one more thing I need to just share with you, and it's about your block. You each have a block, so I'd like for everyone just to hold it up for me, and I'll find you if you don't. So each one of you have a block. And these blocks, they're plastic. They're not even really Legos. They're knockoff Legos. We're really cutting back on our spending. We have about 1,500 of these out here, so we've got a lot of them. But you know, today, these blocks, as I've talked, represent great, big, heavy, concrete stones. Not even concrete, they're stones. They didn't have concrete back then. They're stones that they used to build this great wall in Jerusalem. You all have that block. And you know, we could all take our blocks and we could come forward today, and with 1,500 of these, we could probably build a wall taller than Pastor Shane. Maybe not. But I would like for you to take your block home with you instead. And I'd like for you to use this block to remember your opportunity and your responsibility to the kingdom of God. And for those that attend here to West End Assembly of God. You know, outside these walls, we've got a 50-year history of our church depicted on that wall. And if you haven't looked at it, I encourage you to do so. This has been an awesome church for God for 50 years. We've planted other churches. We've gone on mission trips. We've built homes and churches throughout the world. We've done good. We've done good things. Even if you're not a believer, we've done good things if you look at what we've done. So this church has a great 50-year history. But we've got to extend that wall. The wall can't stop. And we have to make adjustments to the wall. We're not tearing the wall down. We're adding to the wall. We're building the wall. And just like in Jerusalem, we need every one of you to do your block. We need every one of you to help us, to come together, to be united. We need every one of you to be united behind where God is taking us as a church, on a vision. And let me make sure that you understand this. The vision is to reach the world. The vision is to reach our community. The vision is to reach our neighbors. I promise you, Every day, people are dying. People are dying in your community, in your neighborhood, in your family. And the real truth is, people are going to heaven or they're going to hell. It's going to be a challenge. We're going to have external conflicts. We're going to have internal conflicts. But as a team, as a body, we can all come together and make this vision work. But we need every one of you. So take your block home with you. Take your block home with you, and I would ask you to put it somewhere. There's no magnet, so it won't go on the refrigerator. Put it somewhere, and on one side of this block, put your name. And on the other side of this block, I want you to put a question mark. And that question mark is about what God has planned for your life and what God is doing at West End Assembly of God. And I want you to think about that and pray over that. Thank you for coming today. Thank you, Pastor Shane.
Thank you, Pastor Rodney. Amen. Amen. Thank you.